The evening began with a feeling Emily could not explain. A quiet pressure in her chest as the sky over their small suburban street in Ohio turned from pale blue to deep gray. And the house felt larger than usual, filled with spaces where words no longer lived because Mark had been coming home later every night. Eating quickly, speaking less, and tonight he barely kissed her cheek. Before dropping his keys on the counter and reminding her that his nephew Ryan would arrive soon, which should have been a simple family visit but somehow felt heavier. As if this ordinary plan carried meaning neither of them wanted to say out loud. And Emily moved through the kitchen setting plates, noticing how Mark stayed on his phone, nodding without listening. While the front door opened and Ryan stepped in with a polite smile and a small travel bag. Taller than she expected, calmer too, his voice soft when he greeted her, thanking her for having him, and for a moment Emily felt embarrassed by how nice it was to be looked at directly, as if she mattered. Then dinner passed quickly with safe talk about work, traffic, and weather. Mark answering with short words, Ryan filling the silence without trying too hard. And when the plates were cleared and the clock passed 9, Mark stood up suddenly, rubbing his eyes, saying he was tired, that the week had drained him, and without looking at Emily long enough to notice her surprise, he told Ryan to make himself comfortable and suggested they play a game or watch something together, which landed oddly in Emily's mind because it sounded like permission instead of kindness. And before she could respond, Mark went upstairs, leaving the sound of his footsteps fading while the house settled into an awkward quiet. And Emily stood still, unsure whether to follow him or stay. Feeling abandoned but also strangely free. And Ryan waited kindly, not pushing. Until she forced a smile and suggested a card game, pulling a box from the shelf with hands that felt warmer than usual, and as they sat at the table, the pace of the night changed. Words came faster. Laughter slipped out before she could stop it. And Ryan talked about his long drive, about being unsure of his future, about wanting to do something meaningful but not knowing what that was yet, and Emily listened with real interest, surprised by how natural it felt. How easy it was to speak without measuring every word, because Ryan didn't interrupt, didn't rush, didn't check his phone. And when he asked about her, she answered honestly without giving away too much, sharing small truths about work stress, about feeling stuck, about how time changes people in quiet ways, and the cards flipped quickly. The minutes passed faster than she expected. The house, wrapped in soft lamplight, and though nothing improper happened, Emily felt something shift inside her, a reminder of who she used to be before routine had dulled her edges. And when the clock crept toward midnight, she realized Mark hadn't come back down, hadn't checked on them, hadn't asked how the evening was going, and instead of anger, she felt a deep, slow ache. Because his absence felt like a choice, not an accident, and the night outside pressed against the windows as if listening. And Emily wondered how long her marriage had been running on habit alone, how long she had been waiting to be noticed. And sitting there with Ryan, still playing, still talking, she understood that the night was no longer just a night. It was a mirror showing her the distance she had ignored for too long. And as she shuffled the cards again, heart steady but heavy, she sensed that this simple evening had already crossed a line not of action, but of awareness, and there was no turning back from that. The night moved faster once the first game ended, as if time itself leaned forward, and Emily suggested another game without thinking, her voice lighter than it had been in months. While Ryan smiled and agreed, shuffling cards with calm hands, and they talked as they played, not deep at first, but honest, about his college years in British Columbia, about changing majors, about the pressure to succeed, and how everyone expected him to have answers he didn't yet have. And Emily listened closely, nodding, offering small words of support. That surprised her with their sincerity, because she wasn't fixing him, just hearing him, and Ryan noticed that, telling her she had a way of making people feel understood, which made her pause, because it had been so long since anyone had said something like that to her, and she laughed it off, but inside something warmed. And the conversation shifted, naturally, flowing into memories, hopes, quiet regrets, and Emily shared pieces of her life she rarely spoke about. Like how she once wanted to open a small art studio, how she loved long walks and old songs, how marriage had slowly become a schedule instead of a feeling, and Ryan didn't judge or give advice. He just listened with respect, eyes steady, asking thoughtful questions that made her think instead of defend. And the hours passed unnoticed as the TV stayed off. The house silent except for their voices and the soft sound of cards on wood. And when Emily realized it was past midnight, she felt a brief shock, followed by relief because for once she didn't feel tired. And she didn't feel lonely. And when Ryan suggested switching to a puzzle on the coffee table, she agreed, sitting on the floor across from him, keeping a careful distance, yet feeling a closeness that came from shared attention, not touch, and as they worked piece by piece. Ryan spoke about his fear of becoming invisible in his own family, always seen as the younger one, the unfinished one. And Emily felt the words strike something deep inside her, because invisibility had become her quiet companion too. And she admitted that sometimes she felt like her presence no longer mattered. That she spoke and no one truly heard, and saying it out loud felt risky but freeing. And Ryan responded softly, telling her that tonight she mattered, that her words mattered, and though he meant it kindly. The statement stayed with her, echoing, louder than it should have. And she looked toward the stairs again, half expecting Mark to appear, but the hallway stayed dark, and the realization settled in slowly that Mark had chosen sleep over connection, comfort over curiosity, and Emily felt a mix of sadness and clarity instead of anger. Because this distance hadn't appeared suddenly, it had grown quietly, night after night, and sitting there on the floor, she saw her marriage from the outside, like a story she had been living on autopilot. And the puzzle neared completion as the clock moved closer to 2, and when the last piece clicked into place, they both smiled, a small shared victory. And Ryan stretched, apologizing for keeping her up so late, but Emily shook her head, saying she was glad for the company, and she meant it more than she wanted to admit. And as they stood, she noticed how calm she felt. Not nervous, not confused. Just awake in a way she hadn't been in years, and they agreed to call it a night, turning off the lights together. And as Emily walked toward the stairs, she paused, listening to the quiet house, realizing that nothing improper had happened, no lines crossed, no rules broken. Yet something important had changed inside her, because connection had returned to her life from an unexpected place, and as she climbed the steps, she knew the night had already given her more than distraction. It had given her truth, and that truth was moving fast, even if she wasn't ready to face where it would lead. The quiet deepened after they turned off the lights. But sleep did not come easily for Emily because her mind stayed active, replaying the night in fast pieces. Not the games or the laughter, but the feeling of being present again. And when she finally lay down, she stared at the ceiling, hearing Mark's steady breathing beside her, realizing how far apart they felt even in the same bed. And sometime later she got up for water, moving softly down the stairs where the house felt different now, heavier, and she noticed Ryan still awake in the guest room, light spilling under the door. And when he stepped out to apologize for the noise, they stood there briefly, careful, respectful, both aware of the thin space between comfort and confusion. And Ryan thanked her again for the evening, saying it helped him more than he expected, and Emily smiled, wishing him good night before returning upstairs, where Mark shifted and asked casually if she had fun, his tone light, almost distant. And she answered yes, without detail, because words felt too important to waste. And the next morning came quickly, sunlight filling the kitchen as Emily moved through familiar motions, making coffee, packing lunches, but everything felt sharper, clearer. And when Ryan came down ready to leave early, he hugged her politely. Gratitude clear, but boundaries intact, And Mark watched from the table, quiet, observant, not angry, but thoughtful. And once Ryan left, silence settled between husband and wife, no distractions left, and Mark finally spoke, saying he was glad Emily wasn't lonely last night, the word lonely hanging in the air longer than either expected. And Emily felt something tighten inside her chest because it sounded like acceptance of distance instead of concern. And she looked at him fully then, seeing not a villain but a tired man who had slowly stopped reaching. And she realized this wasn't about blame but truth. And she told him calmly that the night made her see how much she had been missing, how unheard she felt, how empty routine had become. And Mark listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding because deep down he felt the same separation. And for a moment neither spoke, both facing a reality they had avoided. And Emily understood that Ryan had not created this moment. He had only revealed it, acting like a mirror instead of a spark. And she felt a strange gratitude for that clarity, because confusion had been replaced by honesty. And as Mark admitted, he didn't know when they stopped choosing each other. Emily felt sadness but also relief, because naming the problem made it real. And though no decisions were made that morning, no promises or arguments, something important had changed, because Emily no longer blamed herself for wanting connection. And she no longer ignored the gap between who she was and the life she was living, and as Mark left for work, kissing her forehead out of habit, Emily stood alone in the quiet house, aware that the night before had not broken anything. But it had shown her where the cracks already were, and for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them, whatever that might mean, because clarity moves fast once it arrives. And there was no returning to sleep after waking up like this. Morning did not feel like an ending, but like a door opening. And Emily woke early, with a calm she hadn't felt in years, the house quiet except for soft light spilling through the windows. And as she moved through the kitchen making coffee, she understood that the night had changed her without drama, without damage, simply by reminding her who she was. And when Mark came downstairs, tired but present, they sat across from each other in silence that was no longer empty, and he spoke first, admitting that seeing her engaged and alive the night before made him realize how far he had drifted, how much he had taken her steadiness for granted. And Emily listened carefully. Not angry, not defensive, just honest, telling him she did not want to live in a marriage where connection was optional, where loneliness was quietly accepted, and her words were firm but gentle, shaped by clarity instead of hurt. And Mark nodded, understanding that this was not a threat but a truth. And they talked openly for the first time in a long while. Not about blame, but about distance, about how love can survive yet still fade, if not cared for. And as the conversation moved quickly, they agreed that something had to change. Whether that meant rebuilding with effort or accepting that their paths might slowly separate. And though the future felt uncertain, Emily felt strong because fear no longer guided her. And later that morning, she went for a long walk through the neighborhood, breathing in cool air, noticing details she had ignored before, feeling grounded in her own steps. And she realized that the night with Ryan had not been about attraction or crossing lines, but about reflection, about seeing herself clearly through simple human connection. And she felt grateful that nothing improper had happened, because what she gained was far more meaningful than a moment. It was awareness. And when she returned home, she began making small changes, calling an old friend, pulling out her art supplies, writing down thoughts she had kept buried, choosing herself in quiet ways. And over the following days, Mark made efforts too, initiating conversations, showing up more, listening instead of assuming. And while everything was not instantly healed, movement replaced stillness. And Emily understood that even if the marriage eventually changed form, she would be okay, because she had found her voice again. And weeks later, when Ryan sent a polite message thanking her for the stay and wishing her well, she smiled softly, feeling no confusion, no longing, only gratitude for a moment that helped her wake up. And as she stood in the living room one evening, sunlight fading gently, Emily felt something settle inside her. A quiet confidence, knowing that sometimes a single night does not change your life by what happens, but by what it reveals. And from that night on, she refused to disappear again, choosing presence, honesty, and emotional courage, no matter where her story would lead next.